Now we got to come back after these more historical questions, come back the question that is mostly discussed in the literature about the instrumentalism, the supposed instrumentalism of F53. And this is the absolute standard, which you find also when sociologists speak about Friedman or whatever. I mean, the normal story is simply Friedman is the instrumentalist, period, right? No further question asked. And if you only spend then 10 minutes and go through Friedman's paper, you find passage, yeah, he's an instrumentalist. Yeah, you got to test it, but it's and can't test the assumptions. Okay, now let's ask this question a little more carefully. What we have to assess here is whether economic hypotheses and theories, whether they are realist or instrumentalist. Okay? And the question is to repeat that, what that means. Do these economic hypotheses and theories claim to represent reality? Or are they mere instruments for prediction without any claim to realistically represent the system in question? By the way, in computer science, something like that is called an emulation, right? You have a system, and if you want to emulate it, you are not saying, I'm trying to find out what's inside the system. But what I'm doing is, I look at the input-output relations, and I want to simulate the same input-output relation, and I don't care what's inside it. That's called an emulation. It's not a simulation. It's you emulate the system, meaning I just reproduce the input-output relations, and I don't care what's in it. So that is instrumentalism in that sense. So, and you don't claim, then you make a model, so you represent an Apple computer by a DOS computer, right? And then you say, I want to just generate the same input-output relations, and you don't care what the hardware architecture is inside. You just say, all I want to have in my emulation is the input-output relation, and that's instrumentalism. And this is what people think that Friedman espoused, that he says, I don't care whether my hypotheses somehow represent reality, at least approximately. No, Friedman does not care about that. He's an instrumentalist. He just wants to have correct predictions and doesn't care about anything inside that black box. Now, economic hypotheses contain assumptions, Friedman's assumptions, that are descriptively false but analytically relevant. And then I've distinguished two types of assumptions. Now I'm starting to bore you, I guess. Falsities due to abstraction and idealization, and also falsities due to abstraction and substitutions. So you have to distinguish these two assumptions, and then you have to ask, so what is the consequence of these types of assumptions for the supposed instrumentalism? Is that really, do they really make Friedman an instrumentalist in F53? Now, again, we have to further specify that in economics, both types of assumptions are ideal types. You know, he first speaks about them more general in sections 1 to 4 of his paper, then he's turning to the applications to economic issues, and then he specifies. So we have to ask him whether when he's an instrumentalist concerning economics, we have to read that then the assumptions are ideal types, for instance, perfect competition and rational behavior of management. And I showed you that also we can the substitutions read as ideal types. This is a slight extension of what Weber originally meant, but I think it's completely in the spirit of Weber there. Now, using these ideal types in hypotheses implies the claim that they represent, even in their idealized form, the truly relevant factors in the given problem. Right? That holds for both types. It's the truly relevant factors that are in there, and you have to choose the ideal types. I'm repeating only Friedman, it's not my own opinion. It's really what Friedman says. So this is the idea of using the ideal types to isolate the truly relevant factors or something causally equivalent in the substitution case. Right? This is what he wants. And of course, this claim must be substantiated by successful prediction. This is just first, it's only a faith, you know, that you believe that ideal type will do the job, but then you have to substantiate that and say, yeah, it gives the right predictions, and therefore I can be pretty sure that I really picked the most relevant causal factor. Right? Now, in the first case, now I go in detail through it. In the first case of falsity due to abstraction and idealization, one real factor is highlighted and idealized, for instance, competition, and other factors neglected. Of course, real factors, right? And the idealization and falsities, I say, yeah, the other factors don't play a role, and I idealize this one. In this case, the ideal type approach is clearly realistic, because the pertinent ideal type directly targets real factors. Yeah, he's just picking out the real factor, and the falsity is produced because it's an idealization. It's not the reality. The reality is much more messy, but I'm just picking out the most relevant one. So when I describe this one, I drop this one. If I say there is only constant gravitation, it's absolutely false, no doubt, but it's the relevant factor if I want to predict what this thing is doing, right? Because the other factors are irrelevant in comparison. Right? So, of course, it's realistic. He wants to target the real factors. Otherwise, you wouldn't trust that factor will give you good predictions. Why should another factor that's not real give you good predictions? Unless it's a substitution for the real factor, right, with the same causal effects. But otherwise, if you say the real factor here is, I don't know, it's color. Yeah, that's idiotic. I mean, how could you guess that the color would somehow determine how that thing behaves in falling? It's certainly false. But if you say the really relevant factor is gravitation, and now I idealize it, yeah, that's a chance that you get right predictions. So you got the real factors, of course. Yeah, what else? And also in the second case, the falsity due to abstraction and substitution, one real factor is highlighted and substituted by another factor that is in a credible way causally equivalent to the real factor, right? You only, and you have a theory for that, then selection theory, or at least some indications that you say, yeah, that's plausible, but it's again the same causal effects, right? The causal effect of calculating the differential equations and then doing the billiard ball, the causal effect is the same as the sort of experience that the expert billiard player has internalized, right? The effect is the same. They do exactly the same push right to the ball. The effect is the same. And therefore, we say if we only want to predict, we can substitute one for the other, but that's the real factor, right? So again there, it's a real factor is highlighted, but in this case, the ideal type approach has an instrumentalist flavor, right? You may say, but wait a minute. I only use this intentionally false instrument of supposing the billiard player really calculates. That's false, and that's only an instrument. So you can say, no, this is somehow instrumentalist, isn't it? It's not fully instrumentalist, because otherwise you wouldn't need that argument, and this is causally equivalent to the real thing. Right? That the instrumentalist never needs. He says, I only care about predictions. So it's not fully instrumentalist, but it certainly has some instrumentalist flavor. And of course, that brought people to the idea that he's an instrumentalist. Now, but the point is, full instrumentalism treats the real system as a black box and tries to model the relevant behavior, typically input-output relations. So you do something with the system and then you look how it reacts. That's input-output relations, right? But whatever means. And the only evaluative standard is predictive success for instrumentalism, right? Like in the emulation. You emulate one system by another one. You are only interested in predictive success. Nothing else counts. Then you are an instrumentalist, right? And this is here not really the case. In Friedman's examples, a part of the real system is substituted by something else for whose causal equivalence arguments have to be given. Right? He first uses selection theory to make it plausible, and then he says, finally, predictions are decisive. So this is not really, he does not say, I don't care, you can substitute it by anything. No, you've got to have selective theory. And he shows, all the examples show that. He says, it's plausible to substitute calculations, by other optimality reaching mechanisms, namely selection. Therefore, it's plausible. Okay, that's a plausible mechanism to generate the hypothesis. Now we've got to test it, whether it makes good predictions. And this is, of course, what he wants to do. So, yes, finally, predictions are decisive. So, for example, well, this is what I said. Real thinking processes of expert billiard players or successful managers are substituted by the respective rational calculations. And the argument for the substitution is that the success of the actor is only explainable if it's equivalent to the result of rational behavior. Background selection theory, right? because then, you know, if the actors aren't optimally behaving optimally, then someone else will find out the optimal behavior and then sooner or later push that first actor from the market, right? Thus, an ideal type methodology is realist by targeting on the most important real factors. That's clearly the realist part, but is willing to replace scientifically intractable factors by, for example, equivalent rational substitutes. Right? So there is an there's an instrumentalist flavor in that, right? So this is exactly it's real factors. So the decisions of the managers or the decision of the billiard players are the real factors. And then you say, you know, what is their constitution? And then you say, oh, that's psychological stuff. I don't know. But we have good reasons to replace it by a rational reconstruction, namely by optimality calculated by expected utility theory or differential equations of mechanics. So this is what is going on there. And then the question is now, I said it has an instrumentalist flavor, and the question is, does this move make the ideal type methodology instrumentalist? Again, this concerns only the second type, about which Friedman only talks in the examples, unfortunately not in the main text, so this is really confusing. But the question is now, does it make ideal type methodology instrumentalist? And there, comparison with physics is useful, because this whole talk about instrumentalism and realism is much more appropriate for physics than it is for economics. I mean, in the beginning, I did not, when I came and started reading that, I did not understand what they were talking about, because I know the discussion in physics and the philosophical discussion, and that is related to physics. But anyway, so let's compare that with physics and then get perhaps a little better feeling. So a physicist using Galileo's law of free fall or the liquid drop model of the atomic nucleus would not at all see herself thereby committed to global instrumentalism, right? Remember, global instrumentalism is the question here, namely that all successful theories, not a single one, is evaluated, whether it's only an instrument or whether it's really true somehow. So it's about global views. So if you take now a realistic a physicist with realistic inclinations, and I'm a realist, and of course she would also use law of free fall, also use the liquid drop model in this situation from 1930 on, and would say, when you ask you, but you're using this model, but you are a realist, you say, yeah, sure, I'm a realist, but that's the best model. What else shall I use? Of course I'm a realist. And I know that this is only a model, right? And I know that the nucleus is not a fluid, but of course I'm using that. I'm a realist, yeah? This is only an approximation, they would say, right? Would say, yeah, sure, I'm a realist. Okay. A realist interprets Galileo's law of free fall as representing, in idealized form, the real force governing the free fall. So a realist physicist says, yeah, gravitation is really here in the world, right? And this body falls by the law of gravitation, and gravitation is something absolutely real. It's there. And we target it and describe it in idealization with the law of free fall. And the same is with the liquid drop model. The liquid drop model is a possibly temporary device that successfully approximates the real nucleus, as can be inferred from the predictive power of the model. So a physicist who is a realist says, yeah, unfortunately, we cannot build a model, out of particles of the nucleus, and the best is now this liquid drop model, and let's see, and then we work with it, right? And then, of course I'm a realist. Yeah, I know that this is an approximation. Of course I know that a nucleus is not a liquid drop, but I'm a realist, and this is the best that's available, and therefore I use it. Yeah, and so the approximation in some unclear sense. Yeah, well, it's not, but the particles are small, and it's not only 2 particles, but 200, and 200 is already almost a liquid. This is how physicists think there. And they say, oh, yeah, of course, yeah, it's a model. And that has nothing to do with my overall conviction of as a global instrumentalist or realist. So physicists would say, yes, that's realism. Of course it's realism. No commitment to global instrumentalism is implied. Nothing at all. And I would say we can transfer that to our friend here. By analogy, Friedman's ideal type methodology does not commit him to global instrumentalism. It's just false. It's just, you would never do that in physics. Why should you do it here? And he wants to target the real factors, those factors in reality that do the work, right? That he wants to target. And then there are different ways of targeting him. According to Friedman, the descriptively false assumptions contained in economic hypotheses, they concern the most important real factors of the problem situation, but in idealized and purified form, or unreal factors that are plausibly causally equivalent with the most important real factors in idealized and purified form. So he never really moves away from reality. He just says, look, in the second case, we don't know what's going on in the brain of this manager or in the brain of that billiard player, but we have very good reasons to replace that, by a rational device. And therefore, I'm sticking to reality. I'm just, replacing it with something with the same effects as reality and with the great advantage of being scientifically treatable, because these differential equations can be solved. But really finding out what's in the brain of that expert billiard player, no chance in 1950. Neuroimaging in 1950s was very poor. All right. So in both cases, the identification of the most important real factors or their causal equivalence, respectively, is hypothetical and in need of empirical control. This is, of course, what Friedman is fully aware. He knows what he's doing. Therefore, economic hypotheses have to be tested empirically by their predictions, and this is why Friedman stresses that much. These empirical tests have the final say on the appropriateness of the ideal types used in the hypothesis articulation. Right? He knows what he's doing and says, therefore we're going to test that. Therefore, the discussion about F53 status with respect to global instrumentalism versus realism is, I think, misguided. That's not the issue of F53. That's not his point. Right? People jumped on that for unclear reasons, and this is not the point. He wanted to analyze economic practice, scientific practice, in terms of Weber's ideal types, because he thought that's the most appropriate model, and the whole question has very, very, very little to do with the distinction between realism and instrumentalism. Okay. Now, I said in the beginning that every interpretation of Friedman must come to terms somehow with these very strange and irritating statements and facts that you find there. And in the literature, you find really that people said, I'm going to ignore the following things of Friedman. I think they're just, I'm going to ignore them. And then comes some sort of flimsy argument. You must say, he was drunk at that time, or smoked some weed. Well, not in 53, but anyway, he was crazy, or what a temporary confusion or whatever. But the normal attitude that historians and philosophers carefully reading texts is, no. You got to come to terms with all the stuff, and it's sometimes very implausible that the author was just temporarily out of his mind. So I quickly go through them, and then I have a summary, and then we have even 20 seconds discussion. So one of them was, in short, positive economics is or can be an objective science in precisely the same sense as any of the physical sciences. Well, this is because he argues that the ideal type methodology in economics has substantial parallels to the building and testing of hypotheses in physics. And he's even more right than he knows, because he knows too little physics, right? And this example there of the nuclear the liquid drop model shows that even his second type of falsities has a parallel. Then the term assumptions occurs 73 times with scare quotes, and they are the central topic of F53. To call them assumptions without scare quotes was misleading, because Friedman's assumptions are contrary to normal assumptions, intentionally descriptively false in the sense then of ideal types, right? He's absolutely reflectively clear what is going on there. And then truly important significant hypotheses will be found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptions of reality, and in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. That second part is where most people capitulate. They say that Friedman is just out of his mind. No, he is not, I think. Hypotheses are the better, the more accurately the involved ideal types identify the relevant factors of the pertinent phenomena. So the sharper your ideal types cut out the relevant factors, right? The sharper they do it, the more abstract. They do that to get really at the relevant factors, the better is the more fruitful is the hypothesis. And of course, the sharper the ideal types cut, the less realistic they are as a descriptions, which they are not intended to be, right? So this is what he means. The more significant the theory, that means the more or finer or better or sharper ideal types it uses. And of course, the more ideal types you use, the more descriptive inaccuracy you introduce. Of course, yeah, but that's not a failure. That's a virtue, right? That's a virtue because that shows I'm really getting, if this hypothesis is successful, I'm really getting at the fundamental causal factors. Therefore, my theory is better. So this is what he means, and I think he is right there, but I mean, it's badly expressed, I must say. And then the basic confusion between descriptive accuracy and analytic relevance that are unrealistic. Ideal types have to be judged according to analytic relevance, the identification of the most relevant factors. That's the analytic relevance, right? Analytically relevant is if you look at a situation that's messy and then you find out, wait a minute, there are three really important causal factors that really determine, in principle, all that's happening. That's the idea, right? And that is what the analytic relevance is, and that is what ideal types exactly do. They isolate what's relevant there, the causally relevant. And then this one, which doesn't fit with instrumentalism, hypothesis that appears deceptive and blah, diverse phenomena, manifestations of a more fundamental and relatively simple structure, where I said, look, I challenge every instrumentalist what Friedman is saying here. Now this is, when you read it, yeah, we don't know. Phenomena are manifestations of ideal types. Right? These are the fundamental things. So you have a messy situation, a messy cigarette market under certain situation. Then you say, hey, in situation A, ideal type explains most of the stuff. And in situation B, ideal type B explains most of the stuff. This is what he means. So you've got to find what's underneath the mess. What are the relevant causal factors? This is what he says. And I think he's right. I mean, even for people who are not connected in any way to Weber. There are many proper topics in F3, yes, as the choice of ideal types is not strictly empirically controlled. Strong means are necessary to test hypotheses involving ideal types by their predictions. Okay, so my conclusions here about this paper. Friedman's F53 is not at all an instrumentalist manifesto. This is a crass misreading. It is written in the same realistic spirit that most scientists share. Anyway, it's only in physics where you have some people, because of quantum mechanics and all that stuff what nobody understands. There are people that say, it's only instrumentalism. But if you read to normal scientists in geology, in the social sciences, of course, they all say that whatever they use theoretical terms, they think they are there. Most people, anyway. F53 is an application of Weber's methodological theory of ideal types, which Friedman learned from his teacher Frank Knight at the University of Chicago. Historically clear. Assumptions in Friedman's sense are not statements claiming truth or plausibility, but intentionally false statements that isolate one particular factor, an ideal type, that is conjectured to be the most relevant one for the given problem. In order to contain the speculative excess associated with the conjectural ideal type in an economic hypothesis, a strong dose of proper and empirical control of the hypothesis is necessary, because it should be a science like physics, economics, and therefore you need empirical control. And since its publication, the influence of Max Weber's ideal types on F53 has mostly been overlooked. Its fundamental point of view has thereby mostly been misjudged as instrumental and not as a Max Weberian type, and its sophistication has mostly been underestimated, I think. And this is, of course, a very bold statement for which I will get not only compliments in the future. Thank you very much. We have a 3 weeks break now because of Easter and then Sechseleuten, and I hope I see you all healthy and well in 3 weeks, and then we go to models more generally. Thank you very much.